Welcome back to Module 4, Growing Infrastructure with Microsoft Azure. In this module, we'll be talking about how you can leverage different Microsoft Azure services to be able to take certain workloads that may have been running on-premise or new workloads that the customer's thinking about, and having the choice of either running them on-premise or taking a look at Microsoft Azure as your information as a service platform. So as we take a look at Microsoft's Azure IaaS at a glance, just in this overview slide, what we can see here is that what we've got is that Microsoft manages the orange sections here. So the virtualization, they manage the servers, the storage, and the networking. And then it's really the customer or you as the partner that handles running things such as the operating system, middleware, etc., the applications that are running inside of your VMs. So if you think about this in terms of Microsoft running a whole bunch of Hyper-V servers, and you're getting access to the virtual machines, or to your virtual machines and your customers' virtual machines that run inside of those. So when we take a look at Azure Platform as a Service, or PaaS at a glance, what happens here is that, here we've got a higher level of abstraction where Microsoft is actually running more of those capabilities. So in this case, you can see that it's really only the applications and the data that's running here. So with PaaS, Microsoft offers your customers a solution to offload their platform components. So it starts giving you a bit more flexibility overall, where Microsoft starts picking up more and more of that underlying workload so that you can just focus on running the components that you actually need to run. So starting to drill into the Azure virtual machines in a little bit more detail here. We'll talk about these in quite a bit more detail as we go through, but this is really all about thinking about what you'd currently run in a virtualized environment and picking and choosing whether it's appropriate to run it in your on-premises infrastructure or moving it up to Microsoft Azure. So some of the kinds of conversations you should be having here with your customers is this an application that people are more commonly accessing while they're outside of the network versus inside of the network? What are the bandwidth requirements for the application? So if it's like a thin SQL type application that doesn't really send that much data up and down, it may make more sense to start looking at the Azure options versus having SQL Server running on premise. But of course there are a lot of different scenarios and we'll start working through these. But the big idea here is that as soon as you start talking about remote users or external users and you don't necessarily want to start letting them back inside your network, then taking a look at IaaS services provided by Microsoft Azure might really be a good option for you here. One of the other components of Azure is the data backup in the cloud option. So the Microsoft technologies, including Windows Server Essentials, and SQL Server, for example, have got the ability to very easily integrate with Microsoft's Azure backup services. And as it mentions, there's a range of applications that are supported. So, SQL Server, file servers, SharePoint, Exchange, etc. The backups are encrypted, they're global, you can have geo-redundant copies distributed around the globe. And now with this, it's consumption-based pricing. So it's really a matter of how much data you're actually pulling back down or how much data you're storing that actually determines how much you're actually paying for this. So you can use a lot of your familiar management tools, so things such as the Windows Server Backup tool or the Windows Server Essentials console will do that direct integration with Azure for you. And the beauty of this is, as you need more storage, you don't need to think about the underlying hardware requirements for this. This is something where you can go through and just keep expanding the amount of storage that's being utilized and just paying a monthly fee to Microsoft based on the amount of data that's actually being consumed. So with Azure Backup, it means that you can offer your customers flexible data recovery options and other powerful backup features. So you can provide convenient features like point-in-time recovery and file recovery. Basically, you pick and choose what it is just to meet your customers' requirements. And you can also customize solutions to meet customer-specific requirements. So you've got flexibility around data retention policy, around data compression. Also, you can start looking at things like data transfer throttling as well. So also making sure that you can just do things such as doing incremental backups, because one of the big concerns people have when you talk about doing a backup to the cloud is, well, how much bandwidth is it going to consume? So this is obviously a situation where you want that data to be as compressed as you possibly can have it before it is pushed up into the cloud. So one of the other offerings inside of Azure is hosting websites. So in this case with hosting websites, Microsoft will go through and handle the underlying web platform infrastructure for you. And instead what you do is build websites on top of that. So you don't have to worry about patching the underlying OSs, etc., or the web servers. It's something Microsoft handles that, and you can go through and build, deploy, and manage websites. You've got flexibility in terms of the underlying cloud or web platforms that they provide. You've got that global network of managed data centers, so you are taken out of the hardware equation, so someone else manages all of that for you. So it's scalable. So if you've got a customer that has to meet peak demand at certain times of day or certain times of year, you know that you can very easily scale out to meet those requirements, but then drop back down so that you're not paying a lot of money for consumption that you're not actually taking advantage of. So you can use traditional tools that you've used to manage websites previously, and you can get production websites up and running within minutes. So it is a very, very fast process. Now, where things become a bit more specific to one of the things we need to start thinking of when we are working with Azure is the Azure Active Directory. So this is something that has developed over time, and what you've got with Azure Active Directory is the ability to easily start synchronizing your local AD, so user accounts, objects, passwords, etc., up into Azure Active Directory. So the idea here is that if you're using different Microsoft cloud services, so if you're using Office 365, or if you're using Intune, or if you're using Microsoft CRM Online, these are all things that are actually leveraging Azure Active Directory. So you could have your on-premises username and password log you into these online services as well. So this starts giving you a lot of flexibility and a lot of simplicity from the user perspective. So instead of, well, here's a new service, here's a new username, and here's a new password, it's that one username and password that can be used across all of them. So you can integrate it with a directory synchronization type approach. You can integrate it with an Active Directory Federation services approach, which is probably a bit out of reach for a lot of SMB customers, but the option is there for customers who do require more advanced federation capabilities. So you can create and manage identities in the cloud, so you can use it in a standalone situation. So if you've got customers who say, look, we just want to be cloud only, we don't want on-premises anything, then that's something that you can do here. But obviously, for most people, they'll still want some things like local file and print, etc., and local Active Directory capabilities for group policy. So as much as you could go cloud only, at this point in time, there are still a lot of benefits of having that on-premises server. Now, other things you can start doing are getting access to multi-factor authentication capabilities. So having Azure send you an SMS to authenticate you, or it dials you to authenticate you, for example, just to make sure that starting to do things such as user self reset of passwords, etc., becomes more achievable. And as I mentioned, Azure AD is effectively the cornerstone of Office 365, Intune, and other Microsoft Online services. And there's also the ability now for you to use the Azure Active Directory Premium capabilities to start also having single sign-on across a wide range of cloud services as well, not just Microsoft ones. So as we start taking a look at Microsoft Azure infrastructure as a service, or effectively here we're talking about running your virtual machines on top of Hyper-V inside of Azure, what you need to think about here is that it's scalable on-demand infrastructure, so it grows as your requirements grow. If you need to add more memory to a VM, if you need to jump up to a higher number of CPUs, for example, you've got a lot of flexibility here in terms of how you actually approach that. So there's a lot of workloads from Microsoft where they will give you very specific details in terms of here are the server workloads we support, here are the server applications we support. And some of these workloads aren't even necessarily Microsoft workloads. So things such as Linux workloads, you've got Oracle are also using this as well. So you've got a variety of different vendors now who will actually spin up VMs inside of Azure so that you can leverage their capabilities. Now you can set up secure VPN capabilities between the virtual machines or the virtual networks and your on-premise environment. As I've mentioned, you can connect with Azure Active Directory. So that means you can also start doing things such as connecting these into your on-premise Active Directory environment as well. Now, if you do have larger customers who are looking at this and saying, well, can I use System Center to get a bigger picture of this and start managing it from System Center? And the answer is definitely yes. Now, the important thing with all of this is that it integrates very strongly with other Microsoft Azure applications and data and storage services as well. So Azure is really growing into quite a one-stop shop for a lot of organizations that are looking to move a lot of their workloads up into the cloud. So let's take a look at the Contoso scenario here. So Contoso are at a point where they need to start making decisions around, do they want to keep investing in their on-premises infrastructure? So they're not going to move everything to the cloud. That's not something that they're really thinking about. But as the number of virtual machines they need to spin up keeps increasing, as local storage costs keep increasing, local hardware costs, etc., keep piling up, and and they're sort of thinking, well, hang on, do we actually have geo redundancy, etc., in here? Is this something where they need to start thinking about how they can leverage certain workloads running up inside of Azure? So in this case, they've got they're saying they've got over 10 new virtual machines. They've got some aging hardware that needs to be replaced. So do they go down the path of, well, we'll keep reinvesting heavily on premise? So with this, it's something that Contoso have done some calculations, and they're saying that for some of the workloads that they've got, that they can run, they can save approximately 40%. So let's take a look at some of this in a bit more detail, so you can get an understanding of where these numbers come from. So when we start taking a look at some of the different tiers that we've got here, we won't spend a lot of time on this because obviously you can take a quick look at it and figure out what it is that's required. But you've got, in the basic tier, you've got A0 to A4, and if we take a look at things like CPU cores, you've got a shared core. Basically, they'll put 4 people per core. So if you're lucky enough to share with 3 other people who don't do much, or 3 other VMs that don't do much, you might be good. If you're sharing with 3 other people who are pegged there 25% at 25% constantly, okay, you're not going to get much more than you've paid for there. Now, what you'll also see here is that it's not just the amount of CPU or the amount of memory that changes as we move through these. So we can go from 0.25 up to 8 CPU cores, and from 768 up to 14 gig with this basic tier. But what you'll also see is that the disk sizes, so we start getting larger temp disk sizes. Also the number of additional disks that you can create and attach. But then also, very importantly for workloads that require disk throughput, you'll see here that as we go through the higher tiers, that we start getting higher IOPS as we start increasing the tiers. So we go from basically 300 IOPS at the lowest tier to 2400 IOPS at the A3 and the A4 level. What we've also got, though, are standard tiers. So if we take a look at the standard tiers, you can see that these start, they start at a similar place, so A0 to A4, but then if we start taking a look at some of the things that are different here, first of all, we'll see that the amount of memory can be drastically higher. We can have up to 16 CPU cores, and also other things to note there is that we can start having a lot more disks attached. So in this case, we've got better performance disk subsystems here, so 500 IOPS per disk. So it's quite a significant improvement over the basic tier. But what you can also see here now is that we can get, because we've got up to 16 drives at 500 IOPS per disk, we can start talking about 8,000 IOPS here. So we can start talking about a very different level of disk performance. So for just general workloads, the IOPS may not be that important, but when you start dealing with anything that's really starting to hit the hard disk with lots of small reads and writes, those IOPS start becoming very, very important. Now, as we start looking at persistent virtual machines with geo-replication, what we've got here is the ability for us to start having copies of our data stored in multiple locations. So when we think about online backups, or when people talk about, well, my data's safe and secure because I've got a RAID array, it's like, well, that doesn't really mean it's safe. What makes your data safe is having multiple copies of it spread in multiple locations. So let's take a look here. And what we can do is now start taking that data, and we can start pushing it out to multiple locations. So one of the things here is in this case, we've got that one copy of data being stored in 3 different locations. We can take this even further, so so that it's not just replicated 3 times within the region. So this provides you high availability, so that if the rack or a storage server, for example, was down for some reason, you still get that high availability. Um, so the other part of this, though, is that your data is copied to another data center that's potentially hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. So these two elements add up and are called geo-replication. So this is something that you are offered by default. So in some other cloud services, this can be a little bit complicated, but from the Microsoft side, they've tried to make this as easy as possible for you, because it's a very important piece of the disaster recovery story, and it means that being able to sort of separate them by such a large distance means that a natural disaster in one geography doesn't necessarily have any impact whatsoever on the data that sits in another geography. Another important detail of Azure are what are called availability sets. So with availability sets, this is really all about providing that 99.95% SLA uptime that Microsoft provides. So for any virtual machines, if you want to meet that 99.95% requirement, you do need to put these in an availability set. So it's not something that will happen by default if you set up a single virtual machine. You do need to have that availability set up. So you can ensure the availability of your application by using multiple Azure virtual machines, and by using multiple virtual machines in your application, you can make sure that the application is available if there's any network failures, disk failures, etc. So in order to keep the platform up to date as new services are released and new capabilities are added, there will be planned downtime. And in order for these applications to stay up, if you've got these if you've got these availability sets configured, it means that if the environment that your single VM is in is offline, then your VM may be offline for a short time period for maintenance purposes. But as soon as you start working with availability sets, it means you've got uptime during that planned maintenance, as well as the limiting exposure if there are any other greater issues that start coming into play here. Now, as we take a look at the diagram here, some of the important things here is that we've got 2 virtual machines running IIS in separate update domains, and 2 virtual machines running SQL Server in separate update domains. So this means that we could use a combination of availability sets and load balancing endpoints to make sure that the application is always available. So this is the kind of flexibility that you do get inside of there. So we've got basically we've got something that can scale out. We've got something that can also support component failure. So we end up with what we'd classify as good architecture on premise also being replicated up into the cloud. Now with affinity groups, this is really all about trying to keep certain types of activities close to each other. So if you say, well, look, I want to build out this environment and I want to make sure that these components are operating at as good a speed as possible, what it means is you can start doing things such as having your compute resources, your storage resources, your network resources, etc., as closely located to each other as possible. So what this means is that you start getting much better performance, latency is reduced, and it also reduces egress costs. So the cost of data leaving the data center is also something that is not going to be a concern here, because it's something that everything is going to be kept in here locally. So with the affinity groups, just a summary of it overall is that, you get aggregation, so it brings the virtual machines, the virtual networks, and the storage services closely together. That reduced latency means that when you're accessing storage from the compute nodes, for example, that lower latency means that you will get much better performance overall. And for the lowering the costs, because we don't have to send traffic between the different Azure data centers, it means that any kind of high bandwidth activity, because we can keep all of that traffic local, it's not something that you or your customer is going to be charged for. So now, when it comes to building out Azure and starting to build out your machine infrastructure here, there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. So you can bring your own VHD files. So an important thing here is that it uses the VHD file format, not VHDX. So when you are creating virtual machines that you may want to import into Azure IaaS, then you do need to make sure that you do keep that as a VHD file. So you can start moving your existing applications. Important things that you need to know is that you do need to sysprep that image before you move it in. So if it's an image that you want to move up and maintain everything intact, you have to think how much of that is going to remain intact after you run sysprep. So another part of this is that, is it that virtual machine you need to import, or is it it might just be the data that's in a database, for example. So you can pick and choose how you actually want to start importing these. Some environments, people rely very heavily on creating the VHDs locally, customizing them, sysprepping them, and then uploading them and running. Whereas in other customer environments, they'll be more than happy just working from the default templates that are included inside of Azure and then just building out on top of those. So let's jump in now and take another look at a scenario. So in this case, they've got several workloads that they want to start moving. So these are not test workloads, these are now production workloads that they want to move to Azure. And at this point, nothing on premise is going to change. So what they'll do is import a couple of the on-prem virtual machines into Azure so that they can test things out, make sure that the import process is working the way that they expect, etc. And then once this this begins, you need to make sure that you go through, you test the networking integration, that the virtual network pieces work. You need to make sure that the AD credentials work in the remote VMs, for example, and you want to make sure that it all works smoothly. So start small and test everything out before you start trying to do some kind of wholesale migration across. So other things that people do a lot with Azure here is, if it's a situation where an organization says, look, we've got a developer who needs to spin up a bunch of new VMs, they only need a short lifespan, you could go through and use Azure to do this instead of them having access or trying to run VMs in a production environment on a production Hyper-V server. You might just say, look, you can just spin these up in Azure, and overall the cost may actually end up being a lot lower, and you'll get a lot more flexibility there. So you get better cost effectiveness. The developer starts learning about, how do we interact with Azure? What are the other Azure services we can take advantage of? And from the developer perspective, it means if they're using common tools that they're used to, such as Visual Studio, it's a very easy transition process. And now the other thing here is that just because the virtual machines are hosted remotely, it doesn't mean that they can't get access to on-prem resources. So the dev could work with your local IT team to make sure that they can get access back inside the network for the workloads that do require that. But sometimes, though, when you are building and doing this build, test, deploy type staging approach, a lot of the time you want to keep these things running fairly independently so you can actually test them extensively before you do start trying to integrate them with your on-premise environment. So now let's jump into the Azure portal so we can take a look at how we go through and provision an Azure virtual machine. The process of creating a new virtual machine inside of Microsoft Azure is very simple. So you can see here I've already got one virtual machine set up. On the left-hand side as we scroll, you can see some of the different areas. And there's just one thing that I really want to point out to you to begin with, which is generally what you want to do before you start building out a virtual machine is to actually build out a network. So if you build out the network, that means you can place that virtual machine in there, and then you can start adding other virtual machines in there as needed. So if you need to set up things such as a site-to-site VPN between your on-premise environment and Azure, for example, it's a lot easier if you actually follow the step of creating the network first and then adding the virtual machines into it. So even if you think about how you build out environments in a physical layout, it's a matter of, you need to have some basic networking infrastructure in place to begin with, because you don't really want to be doing things such as hand coding IP addresses into everything and then later on down the track then dropping in something like DHCP services, for example. So in this case, set up the network to begin with, but for the sake of simplicity and keeping this demonstration short, we'll just go through, we'll create a new virtual machine so you can see the different options that are available. So we've got the option to quick create, but if I choose create from gallery, this will give you bit more of an idea of what we can actually create here. So we can choose from different versions of Windows Server. So, for larger organizations, for example, or something that needs data center, you can run on data center. You've got the ability to run Windows Server Essentials experience up in the cloud as well. So we can also do things such as, fire up an earlier version of Windows Server. So we've got 2012 Data Center, we've got 2008 R2. But you can see here that, as we start scrolling through from the Microsoft side, we've got different SQL versions we can fire up. We've got high performance computing. We've got Visual Studio instances. We've got Windows 7 and 8 instances that we can spin up as well. But then, as I mentioned, we've got the ability to fire up some different non-Microsoft type VMs. So we've got Ubuntu, we've got CentOS, we've got SUSE, and then also things such as Oracle. So having Oracle running here on top of Windows Server, so that for customers that are looking to, they may have a line of business application that really does require Oracle, and moving to SQL isn't an option for them at this time. But for this one, what we'll do is we'll choose Server 2012 R2 Data Center. We can choose from either this month, something that was updated this month, or something that was updated the previous month. Now, we'll just give it a pretty basic name. We'll just call it Windows Server 2012 R2. We'll bring it into the basic tier, and we'll see that as we jump back and forth between basic and standard, obviously standard does have those more advanced options if we really wanted it to scale up. But for the sake of simplicity, for this one, I'll just choose this A1 core, 1.75 gig of memory. So this is just going to be a small domain controller, so that might be adequate for me. So we need to give it a new username, and you'll find that if we try to type in something like administrator, it won't allow me to do that. So what if I try admin? Okay, admin's not allowed either. So just let me give it a name that I'll remember. And again, with passwords, you'll find that if you try to give it too common a password, it will actually not allow you to proceed either. So let's continue on. Do we want to create a new cloud service? And I'll say we'll create a new one, and we'll call the cloud service WS 2012 R2 Cloud, which is unique, so that's okay. And because I've got multiple MSDN subscriptions for Azure, you can see here that I can pick and choose. So this is one of the benefits of your different levels of MPN membership, is getting different Azure credits. So in this case, I can actually do a bit of splitting between multiple ones, but I'll just choose Premium 1 for now. Now for the region, I will choose Southeast Asia, and hopefully if I was recording this sometime in the near future, you should also see the option of getting Australia show up in there as well. Now for the storage account, use an automatically generated storage account. And do I want an availability set? So do I want this to be something that can be replicated to another location? So if I choose create an availability set, what do we call it? We can call it avail. Now these are just temporary names that I'm giving it, so I don't need to really plan it out too much, but obviously in reality you'd give this the same kind of thought and planning that you would to any other machine naming scenario or network naming scenario. So what do we want to do here? So installing the virtual machine agent means that you can go through and it will install and manage extensions that mean that it's easy for you to interact with the virtual machine. Now we can also start installing some other configuration extensions. So there's some by Puppet, by Chef, by CustomScript. You can install the Microsoft anti-malware engine in there. You've got the ability to add semantic endpoint protection or trend micro as well. So you can see here that Microsoft is working with a variety of different vendors to get this up and running. And once we do that, we can see here now that it's going through, it's provisioning it, and it will take a couple of minutes for it to go through and provision this. And then once that runs, the way that we can interact with that is we'll get the ability to connect in via, So what we can do is once that's up and running, we can actually just go through and choose this connect option, and what that will do is fire up an RDP session, and then that makes it very easy for us to go through and perform admin just using the standard RDP clients that are available. So remember, with the RDP clients now, Microsoft has got RDP clients across, desktop Windows, modern Windows apps. They've got Windows Phone apps for remote desktop. They've got the iPad app, they've got iOS apps, they've got Android tablet apps, they've got Android phone apps as well here. So regardless of what platform you're trying to access your virtual machines from inside of Azure, you can just use standard RDP tools to get there. So because this takes a couple of minutes to complete, we won't sit here and watch it finish. Instead, we'll just wrap up. You've seen a quick overview of what's required. You've had a little bit of a view of the Azure portal. But what you can see, though, is as you take a look on the left, there are a lot of things inside of Azure that are outside of scope for this module. But there's a lot of training that's available on Azure if you do want to start taking a look at more of these options in the future. Jumping back into the slides, let's take a look at public identity now. So how we can start working with Azure and Azure Active Directory to keep that as that control point back into the cloud or into your private environment. So with cloud identity management, Microsoft is trying to address the three main issues. So helping IT departments get control of who has access to what on the public cloud, and also looking at things such as providing single sign-on in a secure and efficient manner. So sometimes various departments in enterprises are adopting different SaaS applications, and things such as shadow IT make its appearance, which aren't really what a lot of larger organizations want. In an SMB customer, for example, a way that this might happen is, someone's looking for a quick and easy solution, and they say, well, why don't we just use this consumer-grade file sharing capability rather than using, OneDrive for Business, for example. So there are a lot of examples that we've all seen of that, and if it's not sort of stopped too early, it can get to the point where people rely a little bit too heavily on consumer-type technologies that don't necessarily provide the same level of security or reliability or the same type of software. SLA, for example, for uptime. Now, one of the ways that we can start addressing these issues is we can start taking advantage of using federated connections. So this is one of the areas that the Azure team has been investing very heavily in with Active Directory, so that as you start getting this online identity in Azure Active Directory, that it also starts acting as a gateway into other environments as well. So again, taking that concept of one username and password that you use to log in, but it then allowing you to log into a lot of other locations. Now, this is also going to help you address things such as the password proliferation issues and self-service requirements. So if you think about the number of cloud services from different vendors that you might use during the week, that number just keeps expanding. Even if you start thinking about some of the consumer-related ones that the organization may use for business purposes. So they may have their own Facebook page, for example, where they need to make updates. So even some of those ones where you're thinking, well, why would I want Facebook details in here? But in this case, it's the Facebook details for the organization, not the Facebook details for the individual. So this way you could have multiple people being able to go in and easily access the and update and reply to people in social media situations, for example. Now, we already know the average user has already, they already have to deal with a bunch of usernames and passwords for the on-premise applications, which, hopefully, things have gotten a bit better over the years. And now the cloud-based usernames and passwords just keep piling up as well. So one of the things here is just to make sure that, you can start looking at how you can start taking advantage of your on-premises identity, so what Active Directory provides, and now starting to leverage the single sign-on capabilities up into Microsoft Azure. So as we start taking a look here, some of the things that we've got, on the right-hand side, the three that I've been mentioning repeatedly are some of the Microsoft online services. But then we've also got the they're non-Microsoft cloud-based apps as well. So it might be a custom line of business app. So it might be an ISV app. So it may be your accounting package. It may be an HR package. There's no shortage of things that you may need to integrate from. So the Microsoft perspective here is, why not use Active Directory as a source of all truth and then have that information replicated? But there are situations where people will have other devices, so we need to take those into account as well. So once we start taking a look at PCs and devices, what we have now is well, we know that we can control PCs inside of Active Directory, but what about once we start hooking PCs and devices up to Azure Active Directory? What kind of capabilities can we actually start leveraging once we are up there? And this is really the whole Microsoft Azure Active Directory story. So it's about, device registration and device management. It's around integrating with other directories. It's about providing that central repository or central directory for Microsoft apps, as well as something that either third-party apps can hook into or it can hook into third-party apps as well. So it's really becoming the center of the Microsoft Identity universe. So what is Microsoft's Azure Active Directory? So it's a comprehensive identity and access management solution. It's, it combines directory services, identity governance, application access management, the standards-based platform for developers. But what you've also got, though, is the Azure Active Directory Premium product, which starts providing additional identity and access management capabilities to really start giving you a benefit over just a simple, well, here's my username and here's my password. It starts giving you a lot more capability. So we'll start talking about these in the next few slides. So first up, what we've got is a new world where we've got lots of different software as a service applications. We've got a whole bunch of different devices. So some of them are PCs, some of them are phones, some of them are tablets. Now we've got more things like watches, etc., coming into play. So how do we keep track of what's going on here? So how do we determine which of these different SaaS applications are being accessed? So one of the things that the Azure team has released is an agent that can be installed on the PC devices, and they're looking at other device types moving forward to start tracking what are these SaaS sites or these websites that people are using. So think of it in terms of, what are the ones that it can track? So you'll see that it tracks things where it knows that it's got the ability to start integrating with them. And what we end up with is once we start collecting that data, we can start getting reports around what the more frequently used applications are. So in this case, we can see that obviously the top four here are Microsoft apps. We've got CRM, we've got some Office 365 entries, and we've got Yammer. But obviously things like Box and Google Apps, etc., are also going to be used in some organizations. And what's interesting about this is once this tool rolls out, it's like any discovery tool that's out there. Generally, it presents an eye-opening view to the powers that be around what's really going on inside and outside their network. So if you say to a lot of customers, what cloud services are you currently using? They'll know a couple off the top of their head, but they really won't have the kind of insight that will be presented by this agent. So now as we start looking at directory synchronization, Microsoft's got a couple of different directory synchronization type tools. There's a new one that's also been released, but we'll focus on a couple of the ones that have been available for a while to begin with. So with the Azure Active Directory synchronization, what we really want to do here is have our usernames and also potentially our passwords synchronized up into Azure Active Directory. So this means that if I'm accessing SharePoint Online or Exchange Online or Lync Online, for example, I can just use my standard username and my standard password to sign into that. And really, from the user perspective, that's the kind of simplicity that you do want here. So what we effectively do here is we can pick and choose a set of user attributes that we want replicated, so that then we don't need to push all of the information up into Azure Active Directory. We can just pick and choose a minimal amount of detail to start pushing those details up. So we've got password synchronization, which the DirSync tool provides, and we've also got single sign-on, which requires a more complex solution called Active Directory Federation Services. So if we take a look at the things that are similar, so if all the users really need is the same password to access resources inside the network and outside the network, if you just want to be able to control password premises on premise and you want support for multi-factor authentication, it is stronger in ADFS because it can leverage a lot of internal solutions or on-premise only solutions as well. But provided that the top two and maybe the third one, if that's all you really need, then the password sync or directory synchronization tool may be enough for you. Now, as we start taking a look at the unique things that ADFS provides, it means no password re-entry if on-premise, so it will automatically populate password credentials for you. Authenticating against your on-premise Active Directory. So in this case, we can choose not to have any passwords synchronized to Office 365 or Azure Active Directory, for example. We can just synchronize the user properties and then you're redirected back on-premise to authenticate against your local Active Directory. And then we can also start doing client access filtering with ADFS as well, which is something that we can't do with the pure DirSync option. Now, as we take a look at how we prepare for DirSync, depending on how you've worked with DirSync in the past, if you used it inside of Office 365, for example, you've probably just gone through and enabled directory synchronization directly within there. So this is effectively doing the same thing, but in this case, we're enabling the integration directly within Windows Azure. So all we're really doing here is the same process. It's just through a different portal to do that. So what we need to do is we need to add the domain, we need to prepare for directory synchronization, and then we need to install and run the directory synchronization tool. So if you're familiar with these steps from Office 365, for example, it's a very, very similar process. Now, Microsoft's got a new tool called the Windows Azure Active Directory Sync tool. So this is a new one. So this is actually now a third option that's there alongside directory synchronization and ADFS. And in most cases for SMB customers today, sticking to the traditional DirSync tool is probably going to be the best option. Obviously, over time, things are going to change. But where the Azure Active Directory Sync tool starts to really show its own capabilities is when you're working in larger organizations. So it might be an organization that's got multiple forests, for example, or it may be an organization with, a much more complicated infrastructure. So, for a lot of SMB customers, this the new Azure Active Directory Sync tool doesn't really play as much of a role just yet. But if you think about it from the perspective of why moving forward will there always be two different tools, the answer to this is a resounding no. It's something where having multiple tools causes confusion. So over time, expect them to consolidate, and effectively, it's the size of the customer that will determine the features you enable, rather than which product you actually install. So that's just a very quick overview of some of the Azure Active Directory synchronization capabilities. So what we'll do now is we'll break, we'll come back, and in the next module we'll talk about deploying cost-effective storage, and in this we'll talk about things such as using storage spaces, storage pools, we'll talk about JBOD, we'll cover off things such as some of the enhanced networking capabilities that allow all of these storage solutions to really start scaling out.